Hey there, I'm Chris Versace, Chief Investment Officer at Tematica Research, and each week on our Cocktail Investing podcast, we look to break down all the noise you hear each week into clear investing signals. Here's an example of what we talked about on this week's podcast.
I had actually two things happened to me yesterday that were kind of new. The first one, we tend to do some media, you and I, we've been on Boom Bust before, Fox Business and different programs and stuff, but I was on a new one yesterday, Cheddar. And this is an interesting one. It's streaming only. I think it's really geared more towards the millennials, but really anybody can watch it. And I was on to talk about food with integrity contender company Chipotle. And it was kind of an interesting hit. I got all gussied up, had, the jacket, the tie on and everything else. And I had I think I had my Flash socks on underneath in a pair of shorts because I was able to do it via Skype. So, kind of little more relaxed kind of thing. But it was a fun experience, and I got to talk about, like I said, Chipotle, which apparently is one of the Cheddar 50 stocks. And I think I'm going to be back on next week to talk about the next Cheddar 50 stock, which I know, but I can't tell you just yet. I'll give you a hint though, Lenore. You ready?
Keeping us in suspense.
It's got to do with my favorite movie soundtrack. Oh. I know, I still have to go see that sequel, but I'll get to it. But what was interesting about that? We were talking about Chipotle and the overall landscape. And as I was getting ready, I noticed that Red Robin Gourmet Burgers, ticker symbol RRGB, the CEO came out and she had some interesting comments, which was that casual dining has peaked. Now, if you think of that, that's their business. They turn around and they go, hey, folks, it's over. That's a little disconcerting, I think. And I can understand why it is. You and I have talked about rising debt levels. We've talked about wage growth not really growing or happening, I should say. We've talked about, auto loan defaults. We've talked about student debt levels and people being tapped out.
Yeah. What's actually really interesting to me about the restaurant industry is if you look at how many restaurants there are in the U.S., we really do need to have some of these shut down. But one of the funny things about the restaurant industry is the dynamics within it. Like if you put the investment together to start a restaurant, you have to sign a fairly long-term lease. You buy all the equipment. If it's not working, if you're just barely making it, or if you're actually losing a bit of money, most seem to make the decision to keep going in business, because if you were to close it down, you're going to owe your landlord a very large check to get out of that lease. Of course, all this is unless you declare bankruptcy, and who really wants to do that?
Oh yeah.
So you have to keep paying that landlord because you signed the lease. And on top of that, you made a huge investment in all of these goods, like the tables and linens and all the cooking equipment and all that, and you building out.
Well, there's also a fair amount of individual fit up per restaurant. Right?
Yeah, exactly. And that you can't sell that for much of anything if you decide to shut down. You're going to sell it for pennies on the dollar. So I think a lot of people, and you look at that versus the marginal cost of continuing in business and serving a couple more meals, and your costs there are really low. So your additional incremental costs to stay in business are really low compared to your initial big, huge capital expenditure. And whenever you see that in an industry, you tend to have interesting pricing pressures, right? And people you have businesses operating at a loss. And I think the numbers kind of tell that out. If you look at the math behind how many restaurants are in the U.S., there's, according to Statista, in the fall of 2016, so just towards the end of last year, there was over 620,000 restaurants in the U.S. So we've got a population of 320 million in the country. Now that means, and that's the 320 million includes like toddlers, right? Not big diners, right?
Right.
So if we just take the total number of people in the U.S. and you look at the number of restaurants, each restaurant has an average of 518 possible diners. I mean, that is not a big pool to be working with.
No, it's not. Well, on the one hand, I would say if I walked into a restaurant that was serving 518 people, I would probably turn right around and walk out because it would be way too crowded for me.
Yeah, except for those 518, not every one of them.
No.
And remember, this includes kids. Not every one of them is going to go out to dinner, right? Think about how often, on average, you go to a restaurant. So if every night, let's say 1/10 of that group, which is still pretty big,
so
1/10 of that group decides to go out.
Are you calling for Restaurant Mageddon on the back of Retail Mageddon?
I think there's definitely restaurants well, they're already kind of in a recession, and I think it's probably going to get a bit worse.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen that in the Restaurant News Association tends to put out monthly traffic data, and it's been horrific for them. You know, unlike grocery stores that are, you know, seeing the benefits of lower prices, restaurants have to contend with higher minimum wage. It's a very, very tricky thing. So they
really
can't,
squeezing their margins.
Yeah. So it's a tough business. Going to continue to be a tough business. But I do think this was my point on cheddar, which was that when we look at our food with integrity theme, we look at people maybe trading down from casual dining to fast casual. I do think that Chipotle is probably well positioned as a business stock. A little expensive, but you know,
yeah.
we'll talk about that later. So
Thanks for listening to the podcast, and you can find much more from Tematica Research at tematicaresearch.com, including our Monday morning kickoff, musings on the latest happenings in the economy, as well as our premium products, including Tematica Investing, as well as past episodes of the podcast. If you really want and you don't want to miss out on any issue of the podcast, be sure to subscribe on iTunes. And hey, thanks for listening.
The usual stop, coffee at the coffee shop. Friendly face nowhere inside, same old Saturday night. I really thought the papers I bought would help me forget you for a